Have you ever said yes while every part of you was silently screaming no? There is a kind of suffering that doesn't show on the surface. No bruises, no visible wounds, yet it slowly erodes the soul. It's the pain of self-betrayal, the quiet ache that settles in when we consistently deny our own truth just to be accepted. You say yes when your entire body wants to scream no. You force a smile to avoid conflict, even as your spirit is breaking inside. And over time, this pattern of silencing yourself becomes a way of life. You shape your voice, your words, your presence around the needs and expectations of others, slowly drifting away from who you really are. This is not about kindness or compromise. It's about the subtle and repeated abandonment of self that becomes habitual. At first, it seems harmless, even strategic. People like you become known as agreeable, easygoing, dependable. But beneath that social success, a quiet void begins to grow. You start to feel disconnected from your feelings, your desires, your sense of aliveness. Something sacred inside you is being forgotten, not through some dramatic betrayal, but through 1,000 small choices to stay silent, to fit in, to avoid discomfort. Carl Jung understood this dynamic well. He called the mask we wear to navigate the world the persona. It is necessary for functioning in society, but when we become the persona, when we mistake the mask for our real identity, we begin to fracture. The pain that follows is subtle but persistent. Unexplained anxiety, emotional exhaustion, a quiet sadness that lingers without reason. You find yourself succeeding outwardly while quietly unraveling inside. Self-betrayal is not simply a mistake, it is a psychic wound, and if ignored, it deepens. With every unspoken truth, every suppressed emotion, the soul retreats further. You may look fine on the outside, but inside something vital is being lost. This kind of suffering doesn't demand attention, but it quietly demands your healing. Because until you return to yourself, no amount of approval will ever feel like peace. What if the very identity you've built to survive is the one quietly erasing who you are? The persona, as Carl Jung defined it, is a necessary construct, a social mask that allows us to function in the world. It helps us play roles, meet expectations, and maintain order in our interactions. But the danger begins when we no longer wear the persona consciously, and instead merge with it unconsciously. When that happens, the mask becomes skin, and you forget that there's someone real underneath. You begin to live according to a script, not because someone forces you, but because it's what people expect. You become the composed one, the dependable one, the always kind, always balanced version of yourself. You speak in polished phrases, suppress inconvenient emotions, and craft your presence carefully to avoid disapproval. You don't lie outright. You simply edit your truth until it no longer resembles you. What's terrifying is how socially rewarded this becomes. People praise your maturity, your calmness, your control. You begin to measure your worth by how well you play the part. But over time, the cracks appear. You feel disconnected from your instincts. You no longer know what you want, only what is appropriate. You begin to doubt whether your emotions are valid or just inconvenient flaws to manage. Inside, something stirs, a vague unrest, an invisible fatigue. The soul knows it's been exiled, but it speaks in silence, in tension, in a sadness you can't explain. And the more you push it down, the more the dissonance grows, until one day you realize your life is functioning, but you are not living. This is not about rebellion. It's about remembering. The persona was meant to be a tool, not a tomb. And the real danger is not wearing a mask. It's forgetting that you ever had a face beneath it. Why do you feel anxious, exhausted, or irritable, even when nothing obvious is wrong? Deep inside you, there is a silent war unfolding. On one side stands the ego, the conscious part of your psyche that wants stability, recognition, and belonging. The ego wants to keep everything under control, to preserve the image you've built, to maintain the persona that keeps you socially safe. On the other side is the unconscious, wild, symbolic, and uncompromising. It doesn't care about appearances, it wants truth. When you live too long disconnected from your authenticity, saying yes to things that violate your values, pretending to be okay when you're not, the unconscious begins to protest. But it doesn't speak in words, it speaks in signals. Sleepless nights, a tight chest, emotional overreactions, chronic fatigue, or a vague, persistent sadness. These are not random symptoms, they are messages. Jung believed the unconscious compensates when the ego becomes too one-sided. If the ego clings too tightly to the mask, the unconscious responds by pushing the shadow forward. The shadow, the hidden, denied parts of yourself, doesn't disappear when ignored. It leaks into your life through irrational anger, sabotaged relationships, and compulsive behaviors. You try to stay calm, but you lash out. You try to be perfect, but something keeps cracking underneath. And the worst part, you turn that frustration inward. You blame yourself. You wonder why you can't just handle it. But the truth is, your psyche is trying to restore balance. The more you insist on keeping up the facade, the more violent the rebellion within becomes. The ego wants order. The unconscious demands wholeness. And this internal tug-of-war creates chronic tension. The feeling that you're living two lives, one for the world and one you can't quite name. Healing begins when you stop silencing those inner signals, when you stop pathologizing your discomfort and start listening to it. Because that unease is not weakness. It is the wisdom of the unconscious trying to bring you back to yourself. Have you ever felt like your worth depends entirely on how well you make others feel? Some personalities are more vulnerable than others to the pain of self-abandonment. Carl Jung identified one in particular, the extroverted feeling type. These individuals don't just want harmony, they need it. Their psychological structure is deeply attuned to the emotions, expectations, and reactions of those around them. The moment they enter a room, they instinctively adjust themselves to ensure peace, approval, and acceptance. On the surface, this may look like emotional intelligence or empathy, and often it is. But taken to the extreme, as it often is, it becomes a trap. Instead of asking, "What do I want?" they constantly ask, "What do they expect from me?" Their inner compass gets lost in the noise of others' needs. They become masters at pleasing, at smoothing over tension, at being exactly what each situation requires. But beneath the polished exterior, their true self begins to dissolve. This type tends to equate being loved with being useful. If they are not making others feel seen, heard, or cared for, they begin to feel invisible. And when they are not playing the role of the supportive friend, the understanding partner, or the agreeable colleague, they feel like they don't matter. Over time, they lose the ability to differentiate between genuine care and compulsive self-erasure. The most dangerous part, often they don't even realize it. This adaptation becomes so automatic, so habitual that it feels like identity. But it isn't. It's a performance learned in early life, often as a response to conditional love, emotional instability, or chronic guilt. And while this strategy may have once ensured safety in adulthood, it becomes a source of inner collapse. Living for others is not sustainable. Sooner or later, the soul rebels. If you recognize yourself in this type, understand your sensitivity is not a flaw, but it must be reclaimed. Your needs are not an inconvenience. They are a map back to your truth. You don't have to disappear to be loved. Why does your soul speak louder in silence, in dreams, and in pain you can't explain? The unconscious does not speak the language of logic. It communicates through symbols, sensations, and experiences that often bypass our conscious understanding. When you live out of alignment with your inner truth, suppressing your feelings, denying your needs, and over-identifying with a social mask, the unconscious doesn't remain passive. It begins to signal. Subtly at first, then more intensely, and always through the language of metaphor. You may dream of being chased, silenced, exposed, or trapped. These aren't just random images, they are symbolic representations of your psychic state. Being chased often reflects the pressure of repressed emotions. Silence may point to the impotence of your will. Feeling imprisoned in a dream can reflect your soul's cry against a life that no longer feels like your own. But the unconscious doesn't only speak in dreams, it also speaks through the body. When symbolic messages are ignored, they may become physical. Chronic fatigue, unexplained pain, insomnia, anxiety, breathlessness. These aren't always medical conditions, they are psychological protests. The body, deeply linked to the psyche, becomes a loudspeaker for what the ego refuses to hear. Then come the compulsions. You overeat, overwork, overspend, overstimulate, not because you're indulgent, but because you're avoiding silence, the very space where the unconscious speaks the loudest. And in that silence lies a truth you've tried to outrun. You've built a life that may be admired by others, but no longer feels like home to you. Jung taught that the unconscious has a compensatory function. When the ego becomes too rigid, the unconscious moves to restore balance, not to punish, but to awaken. And if you continue to dismiss its language, it will escalate until something breaks, forcing you to see what you've long avoided. But the message is not destruction, it is reintegration. It is your inner life calling you back, not to who you're supposed to be, but to who you truly are. What if the life you've built no longer includes you? There comes a point when the cost of pleasing others, of maintaining the persona, of performing a life becomes too high. The fatigue is no longer just physical, it is existential. The emptiness no longer occasional, it becomes constant. At this breaking point, something within you begins to stir, and that something is the soul's call toward individuation. Carl Jung didn't see individuation as a spiritual luxury. He saw it as a psychic necessity, the lifelong process of becoming whole. It's the movement of the self toward integration, where all parts of you, light and shadow, strength and fear, desire and doubt, are invited back into the center. Individuation doesn't ask you to destroy your persona, but to stop believing it's all you are. To walk this path is to turn inward, to finally face the parts of yourself you've denied, repressed, or disowned. The disappointments you never voiced, the anger you dressed up as kindness, the fear you disguised as responsibility, all of it becomes material for healing, not shame. The shadow you once feared becomes the truth that sets you free. But individuation is not a comfortable journey. It demands that you disobey the expectations that no longer serve your truth, that you risk disapproval, that you let go of identities built only to survive, and in doing so, you reclaim something infinitely more valuable: your inner coherence. You stop seeking validation and start listening to your own voice again. You may lose people, you may lose status, you may even lose a version of yourself you once relied on. But what you gain is something no one else can give you: your soul. And in that reunion, peace returns. Not the peace of quiet approval, but the peace that comes from finally standing in the truth of who you are. This is individuation, not perfection, not isolation, but wholeness. The kind that can only emerge when you stop abandoning yourself and choose again and again to come home. What happens after you stop pretending? After the mask cracks and the roles fall away, what remains? At first there is silence, awkward, unfamiliar, and raw. When you've lived your life for others, shaping yourself around their needs, adapting to their comfort, becoming the image they expect. The act of letting go feels like falling into a void. You no longer know how to perform, but you also don't yet know how to be. This is the space between fragmentation and wholeness, the tender, terrifying beginning of true selfhood. When you stop identifying with the persona, what you often meet first is not peace, but pain. You realize how much of your life was built on fear. Fear of rejection, of abandonment, of being too much or not enough. You grieve the years spent silencing your needs. You mourn the version of yourself who never had permission to be real. This grief is sacred. It clears the space for something deeper to emerge. As you begin to live from within, rather than from external validation, you experience a subtle shift. Decisions feel more aligned. Relationships begin to change, not because you force them to, but because you're no longer willing to perform inauthentic roles. Some people may fall away, but what remains is honest. And for the first time, you feel what it means to belong to yourself. This is not a sudden transformation. It unfolds slowly, one truth at a time. But with each step, the fragments of your identity begin to realign, not around who others want you to be, but around the core of who you truly are. Wholeness does not mean perfection, it means integration. You begin to accept your contradictions, embrace your complexity, and carry your past without shame. You no longer seek peace through control, you find it through coherence, when what you feel, believe, and express are no longer at war. From this place, life doesn't just continue, it deepens. And you realize wholeness was never out there. It was what remained when you finally stopped running from yourself. What if staying the same is costing you more than you realize? There is a hidden cost to living a life of constant adaptation, a slow, silent erosion of the self. When you prioritize approval over authenticity, when you wear the mask so long that it becomes indistinguishable from your skin, something essential begins to wither inside. At first, it shows up as mild discomfort, a little tiredness, a little restlessness. But over time, it deepens into something harder to name, a quiet emptiness that never leaves. You tell yourself it's just a phase, you stay busy, you perform your roles, you smile when expected, but inside you feel disconnected from joy, from purpose, from yourself. The praise you receive no longer nourishes you. The comfort you've built begins to feel like a cage. You sense that you're drifting through a life that looks full but feels hollow. The truth is, when you consistently betray your inner truth just to keep the peace, the soul begins to rebel. And it rebels in silence, through burnout, anxiety, depression, chronic dissatisfaction. not because you've failed, but because you've disappeared. You've edited yourself so often that you can no longer feel what's real. And yet change feels terrifying. You fear disappointing others, losing status, letting go of the image you've carefully crafted. But what you rarely ask is, what will it cost me if I don't change? The answer is simple and devastating. It will cost you your aliveness, your capacity to feel deeply, love freely, choose boldly. It will cost you the chance to live a life that reflects who you truly are, not just who you've been expected to be. The cost of not changing is a life that never becomes yours, a life spent performing rather than living. But the moment you choose to turn inward, to face what hurts, to listen to what you've long silenced, that is the moment you begin to reclaim your freedom. Because the greatest risk is not in becoming yourself, it's in never doing it at all. What if the breaking point was not the end, but the beginning of your return to wholeness? There comes a moment after all the roles have been exhausted and the mask has grown too heavy when you realize something in you can't keep living this way. That realization can feel like collapse, but what looks like falling apart is often the first movement toward healing. Because underneath the exhaustion, the emptiness, and the confusion, there is still something intact. Your essence, waiting for you to come home. This is where transformation begins. Not with grand gestures, but with quiet honesty. With finally admitting, I'm tired of performing. I'm tired of betraying myself to be loved. That sentence, spoken even once with sincerity, can crack the illusion you've lived inside for years. From that crack, light enters. Not immediately, not all at once, but enough to begin again. Hope, in this context, is not about external change. It's not about finding the right job partner or lifestyle. It's about discovering that beneath all the adaptations, you are still there, intact, worthy, whole. Jung called this process individuation, the deep psychic journey of reclaiming all that was split off, denied, or hidden in the name of survival. It will not be easy. Some people may not understand the new you. Old structures may fall away. But this loss is sacred, because what you're shedding is not your identity, it's your disguise. And what emerges in its place is something far more resilient. A self rooted in truth, not in image. Every time you choose to listen inward instead of seeking validation outward, you move one step closer to yourself. Every small act of honesty is a revolution. Every boundary set, every emotion honored, every moment of silence embraced, it all matters. Because it is all part of your return. The path ahead may still be long, but the fact that you've begun, that you've stopped running from yourself, means everything. You're not broken, you're becoming. And this time, you're becoming you. What if you stopped waiting for permission and finally chose yourself? If you've made it this far, something inside you has already awakened. You've felt the discomfort. You've seen the cracks in the mask. And perhaps, for the first time, you've begun to question the life you've carefully built. Not because it's outwardly wrong, but because inwardly it no longer feels like you. This is your invitation, not to escape, not to reinvent yourself, but to finally return, to reclaim the parts of you that were silenced to keep others comfortable, to stop living for applause, approval, or expectation, and instead to live in alignment with the quiet truth you've carried all along. The persona served its purpose. It protected you. It gave you a place in the world, but now it no longer fits because you've outgrown it. And no matter how much you try to make it work, you can feel it. The growing tension, the dissonance, the ache of a life that's almost but not fully yours. Real peace doesn't come when the world accepts you. It comes when you accept yourself. When you can look in the mirror without roles, without scripts, and say, I am here and I choose me. This isn't an instant transformation, it's a journey. It begins with small decisions, with moments of honesty, with listening more closely to your inner voice than to the noise around you. It continues with courage. The courage to disappoint others in order to be true to yourself. And in that courage, something powerful unfolds. A return to wholeness. If this message resonates, don't let it end here. Reflect, write, share what moved you. Give voice to what has long been unspoken. Because when you speak from your soul, something shifts. Not only in you, but in the world around you. This is not the end. It's the beginning of a deeper life. And it starts the moment you stop pretending and start remembering who you really are. At a certain stage in life, the desire to please others begins to fade. What we long for is something quieter, deeper, a sense of inner peace that doesn't depend on roles, expectations, or approval. Carl Jung spoke of this as the journey back to the self. The moment we begin shedding the social masks we've worn for decades and finally face the truth of who we really are. The most important lesson is this: living authentically doesn't diminish your value. It restores your wholeness. In later years, we no longer need to perform. Instead, we learn to listen to our bodies, to our dreams, to the quiet discomforts that reveal when we're out of alignment. The signals were always there. We just needed space and courage to hear them. Every time you choose honesty over convenience or integrity over acceptance, you reclaim a piece of your soul. And that reclamation is not dramatic, it is steady, subtle, sacred. It is how true freedom is born, not the freedom to escape, but the freedom to be. And perhaps the greatest gift of growing older is this: you no longer need to prove yourself to the world. You only need to return to yourself. And that is more than enough.